afternoon. I want to thank Melissa Spaz, Carolyn Snyder, Ditzy and Tom Lengel, and others for arranging my visit and welcoming me so warmly to Chautauqua. It's an honor to be here. I've known about this remarkable place for decades. I admired friends who attended and many of the authors, performers, and luminaries whom I love. So I'm thrilled to be speaking with you this afternoon. Today, we're talking about ritual. In the last few years, I've been exploring the realm of ritual. I've meandered along the shifting boundaries of ritual life, aided by my unsystematic system of navigation and observation, literature and poetry, and my own questions. On this journey, I continuously wrote personal stories and ventured into new territory to finish my book, Milkweed and Honey Cake. Gradually, I created a provisional map, and in a kind of scavenger hunt, I collected idiosyncratic definitions and a hodgepodge of hints at ritual's purpose in contemporary life. Using my stories today, I'm going to share some thoughts on three aspects of contemporary ritual. First, the notion of revising tradition or custom, the theme for this week, and the risks and opportunities in that revision. Second, I'm going to talk a bit about serendipitous ritual, both secular and sacred. Though as you'll see, that's a blurry boundary for me. And third, I'll talk about the personal, individual changes in a ritual landscape over a lifetime. A caveat: despite that lovely warm welcome with my putative credentials, I'm speaking today as a writer, storyteller, mom, daughter, a member of diverse communities, perhaps a teacher, but mostly as an explorer, like I think all of you are. My words and writing are neither a how-to nor self-help. Maybe they'll prompt you to notice, to reflect, remember, or maybe you'll just listen to the stories. I'd like to start with one from early on. In a pile of photos in my home office in Philadelphia is a small square snapshot from the early 1960s. It's that unmistakable Kodachrome color with the scalloped white border and the date of printing on the back. I'm 5 years old, wearing red corduroys, and I have a short bowl haircut and bangs. I'm standing at the hearth in our very new house. My mother is seated near me, steadying my hand as I light the Hanukkah menorah with a small candle. An ironed apron covers her A-line skirt, and as always, she wears lipstick, her hair in a neat bun. My baby brother is smiling eagerly at the menorah. My sisters stand to my right in pleated plaid skirts and matching headbands. My dad is probably taking the photo, and you can practically smell the potato pancakes frying in the kitchen. It's a warm holiday scene, but notable because the floor is bare, wall-to-wall carpeting not yet installed, and in the background is a pile of unopened cardboard moving boxes. What's remarkable about the photo is not only that my parents somehow dug out the menorah from the crated detritus of life with 4 children and managed to put together a holiday, but also that they chose to do this just 2 weeks after our move, a move which occurred on November 22nd, 1963. So my parents worked to provide a celebration, not because they were particularly religious, I will tell you, not because one had to, but I suspect they wanted to provide some normalcy after the big move and the cataclysmic events in Dallas. I think they recognized that ritual provides a sense of meaning, of continuity, of identity, of light and delight, even in the face of dark days and unfathomable events. In a world that sometimes feels broken, rituals may continue to provide a frame for making meaning, if not repairing, that world. I have chronicled similar moments, but the apparently old traditions in my ritual realm I serve with a twist. So, weddings, graduations, holidays, memorials are garnished with a reinterpretation or revision, not only in extraordinary times, but also to fit my individual quirks and values, a sense of what's fun or beautiful or tasty, and sometimes to complement contemporary sensibilities and concerns, not out of ideological or political certainty, but from a desire to keep it meaningful. I'd like to read a section of a story that reflects some of the notions I've referred to so far. This is called Coconuts. Yes, like the movie. In late January or early February during my childhood, our Sunday school teachers handed out something called Boxer that they assured us was edible. When you shook the large brown pods, seeds rattled and the stringy husks caught in our baby teeth. In 1960s Connecticut, it was usually a snowy day, so my friends and I were skeptical of celebrating this Jewish New Year of the Trees, Tu B'Shvat, when trees were supposedly blooming far away in what they called the Holy Land. As puzzling, the Boxer alone seemed to be the entire holiday. I learned later that the stringy pod was carob. It was probably picked months earlier. You know, this is well before Amazon, right? And slow shipment ensured that by the time we gnawed on it, the Boxer tasted like cracked leather and sawdust with a hint of ancient bitter cocoa. I also learned later that Tu B'Shvat was one of 4 New Year feast days in the Jewish lunar calendar. Ancient tradition forbade eating tree fruit until the plant was 4 years old. So the full moon that coincided with the first budding trees would annually mark the age of a new tree. But observance withered over the centuries along with the agricultural roots of Judaism. Having only the memory of Boxer to mark the holiday, I had little interest until my son was born, as it turned out, on the 15th of the month of Shavat, Tu B'Shvat. I was charmed by the coincidence. Maybe we could celebrate 2 birthdays, a Jewish and a secular one. Over the years, we improvised a Tu B'Shvat holiday with friends centered on a ritual dinner. My culinary goal was for each course to contain a tree fruit in some form, plus raw, whole fruits for ritual eating. So there is an ancient belief and custom about these fruits. I was loosely following it, okay, very loosely. There were no guidebooks then. They exist now. You can buy, I think, a guide to Tu B'Shvat nowadays. Ours was a tasty, if haphazard, affair. In the days before Tu B'Shvat, my children checked the growing pile of fruit on the sideboard to make sure I was including their favorites, especially a whole fresh coconut, which became our tradition for a fruit with an inedible shell. The children sat on the floor, placed the coconut on some newspaper, pounded a nail into the divots in the shell, poured out the milk, and tasted it, and then gleefully smashed the coconuts to bits with a hammer. An adult helped until they were old enough to do it themselves without pounding a sibling's thumb by mistake. As their dexterity improved, so did their messy exuberance and hilarity. So what were we tasting in the fruits of Tu B'Shvat? Since fruit holds the seeds of the next generation, medieval mystics thought that by eating it, they helped God renew nature and fill themselves with holiness. Modern interpretations range from environmental awareness to reconstructed Kabbalistic views. I do love the idea that biting into a kiwi might invoke a mystical, elusive aura or some kind of holy emanation, and something tasty that reminds us to repair our planet is welcome at the table. But for me, additional meaning was infused in the taste of those fruit. The humor was not incidental to the ceremony and had become, like all meaningful rituals, repeated and perhaps necessary. Maybe the mystics laughed too when they broke open a stubborn shell of a tree fruit. As our guests and I watched the children pulverize a coconut and sharing the sweet fruit, what were we tasting? In part, we were simply enjoying a fun, sensory holiday that celebrated the cycle of the seasons and our ties to nature. Perhaps the experience linked the secular to the religious, and maybe the spiritual to the environmental, or prayer to poetry. Or the meaning was elsewhere in the actual taste of carob or kumquat, coconut, or candied orange peel. These are rare flavors for most of us, so maybe we tasted the ephemeral nature of gathering together, sharing a festive meal, creating meaning over time. Perhaps the taste not only evoked transcendent experience or environmental concern, but also highlighted the precious time we had with family and friends. Maybe eating passion fruit or baking carob chip cookies reminded us to value time and life itself, as many rituals do. Could smashing a coconut once a year help us cherish those close to us and act on behalf of those distant from us? The coconut may have also signified my children's devotion to each other. The taste of coconut, pried from its impervious shell, is like the inside jokes and the private stories they shared. A rough shell protects an essence that is sweet, unique, playful, and ephemeral. In addition to these traditional, if revised, rituals, I've also stumbled on rituals that we might not at first recognize as such. In the small moments, ordinary transitions, private sorrows, and unexpected celebrations, in nature and in community, when we might yearn for a visceral act to mark time, to mark what's important, and sometimes to give us a glimmer of the transcendent, perhaps the sacred, no matter our religious beliefs. For me, these moments, secular or contemporary as they seem, are often informed by old ideas, particularly from my Jewish heritage. Maybe it's my literary sensibility or my personality, my tendency to see layers in experience. I don't really know why I do this. I spontaneously draw these associations. So, I'm polishing an old silver demi-tasse spoon from my grandmother. Yes, I actually like polishing silver. And suddenly, I noticed that this tedious and truly unnecessary act parallels an ancient practice in Judaism. The practice is to, quote, beautify the commandment, or more accurately, enhance the mitzvah. Though what I'm doing is secular, it adds meaning to my festive table to say the silver is bright. The idea from Jewish practice was to infuse a basic ritual or religious requirement not only with full attention, but also aesthetic beauty. And for me, someone who colors outside the lines, that idea carries over to the seemingly secular and modern realm. Even as I spontaneously frame these experiences in terms of my own background, I also see them as universal. Yes, I am willing to use that unfashionable word, universal, for these experiences and my interpretations and my intentions are, I think, more generally human phenomena suitable to modern times, no matter how you create meaning, whether in a religious or non-religious context. I have a section of another story that I think illustrates a bit what I'm talking about. Narrow Bridge. My first Thanksgiving in grad school in '83, I drove north from Philadelphia for the first time, navigating the Charybdis of rush hour denizens and the Scylla of Thanksgiving escapees. I was soon trying to keep pace on the life-threatening New Jersey Turnpike and the claustrophobia-inducing Garden State Parkway. And then, a few miles past the border into New York State, the sky opened and the Hudson spread to the horizons. The brown cliffs of the Palisades loomed, and the Tappan Zee Bridge rose, silvery and intricate. You didn't so much cross that bridge as enter its latticed girders, a baby boomer's dream of a giant erector set, anchored by long upsweeps to the banks of the river. In the 60s and 70s, my family would take the bridge from my childhood home in Connecticut to visit cousins in Baltimore or the museums in DC. I'd try not to blink as I watched the steel network whiz by to catch a glimpse of the little white lighthouse on the east side of the river and a flash of the Empire State Building to the south. The car tires echoed on the spans, kerthump, kerthump. Once I had my own children, we'd take the Tappan Zee on our way to holidays and vacations to avoid the George Washington Bridge's glacial pace. Besides, Tappan Zee, named for the Tappan Lenape people and the Dutch word for sea, was fun for my children to say, Tappan Zee. One of the pleasures of crossing was to see what was visible in the distance. If it was clear to the south, the silver gray silhouette of the Chrysler Building. Sometimes a glint of a window. If it was misty, a wash of skyline, maybe a spire poking through the clouds. And even then, it was a shooting star's worth of time in my peripheral vision to get the perfect angle of New York City. But the bridge was not without its shadows. The Wednesday of Thanksgiving week in 2001, the sign for the bridge filled me with dread. My son was a toddler, my younger child a baby. At the crown, I glanced south and saw nothing, just the gaping wound of sky. where the Twin Towers had been. A private ritual took hold. Without a word, I'd regard the empty space above the city each time we crossed as though in pilgrimage. Even when the new fraternal Twin Towers emerged from the skyline, I still nodded to the old tower's ghosts which hovered in the clouds. But there was grace from the sweep of the bridge. Sailboats leaned into the wind, barges plowed upriver. In severe winters, the Hudson could freeze in great chunks of ice that bumped against each other, waves lapping them along, like in the Arctic. This is later in the story. March 2016, I crossed the bridge, sad and alone, driving south from my father's funeral. Not even the radio, just the silent shell of my car protecting me until I could scurry into the sanctuary of my house. I could not remember the drive north at all, only my children singing and playing music to keep me focused on the road. We didn't talk. I'm sure I didn't glance around the bridge. On the first span, heading south, a phrase from a Hebrew song popped to mind. Narrow bridge, from a saying attributed to the Hasidic Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. The whole world is a very narrow bridge, but the main thing to recall is not to be afraid. Though the Tappan Zee was wide enough, my life felt shrunken, so I performed the quick ritual of taking in the panorama, and right away I was on the down sweep to the other side of the Hudson, to New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and I coasted, the bridge carrying me with a fleeting sense of relief and solace to the second half of the journey, away from my childhood town and my father's grave, toward home. So I'm suggesting with this and other stories that ritual may arise in novel, sometimes surprising ways, sometimes informed by old ideas, adapted for one's current needs and perhaps the current zeitgeist. This is precarious territory, though, picking, choosing, revising, twisting, innovating, making it up, applying elusive ideas to mundane acts. There are risks in altering the map of tradition and in creating new rituals. A confession, I'm generally squeamish about do-it-yourself ceremonies. Anything that smells a bit pop psyche, or in technical terms, woo-woo, devoid of history, I'm sort of wary. But I also try to avoid telling people what to do in the context of their ritual moments. Who am I to say what's meaningful for others? My stories and myself are full of contradictions. While I say I don't want to create rituals de novo, DIY, I have come upon new rituals that became meaningful. So what are the boundaries? If crossing an old bridge is a ritual, then what isn't? At several talks I've given this year, people asked me what my, quote, writing ritual is. I have a quick answer. I don't have one. I have a solid routine, but I don't call it a ritual. Perhaps we sometimes use the word loosely. Someone might say, my morning ritual is to exercise, have coffee, do too many of the New York Times puzzles for too long, take the 7:47 train. I'd call that a salutary habit, not a ritual. So maybe part of the distinction for me is semantic. That is, we may use ritual as a colloquialism referring to a useful habit. Yet some aspects of habitual secular acts could be ritualized, say by infusing them with intention, what in Judaism is called kavanah, or with some kind of historic framework or ceremony. So I am quite confident that many of you can think of various religious traditions where consuming specific foods in a specific way becomes more than nutrition or a culinary experience, right? Because of the intention and the addition of meaningful acts surrounding it. And what about community? How does practicing ritual within or with reference to a community potentially alter that ritual? And must it be a defined community, one with deep roots? I would say that even those defined communities with relatively clear ritualistic boundaries offer fundamental human, yes, universal experiences that are perhaps heightened during strange times, as is our desire for community. What I'm suggesting is that in a recognizable community, say an established religious community, it is not only about identity and belonging of a particular kind of meaning, but there are reverberations that I think are beyond that. A short story. During the pandemic, as I'm sure you may remember, our Zoom gatherings paled, and so did we pale. When my religious community finally, after about 18 months, came together physically under a tent, a big tent, it was, and I'll use the word again, the universal aspects that move me, not necessarily being with, quote, my people. It was the sensory, the auditory, the acoustic. It was being in proximity to other human beings, hearing the rustle of paper, the whisper, and the music, the resonance of the instruments and the voices that we could feel in our bodies. Yes, you can turn up the bass, and there were beautiful digital renderings of things, but still. Noticing those fundamental, broad aspects of ritual life and community, for me, enlivens and deepens the particularist aspects of ritual community. But I want to add a little bit about this whole idea of community by asking, must we stay within our, quote unquote, bounds of community, our group? Again, there are risks. A few years ago, I was invited to enter a sacred place in a community not my own on Native American lands to participate in a ritual not my own. I hesitated, really, really hesitated. But then I experienced something unexpected when I did join, something numinous, something meaningful. It was singular, not only in the subjective sense, but relative to my usual behavior. Ordinarily, I am a witness or a guest in others' communities for rituals. For example, at my close friend's Episcopal church in Philadelphia, I attend her family's celebrations or memorials, and I feel truly close to her community. But I myself, do not take communion at the service. That would be an affront to those in attendance, and frankly strange, even blasphemous for me. However, when my 20-something son read a draft of the story about the Native American ritual, he cringed for many, many reasons. For him, it was like my taking communion or something. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps we need to maintain clear boundaries around ritual communities, if we have them. Yet it's delicate, isn't it? The balance between integrity of ritual and exclusion of others, coherence, and the immersion of an echo chamber? I don't have an answer for you. But I'd like to turn to another dimension of ritual. While a meaningful ritual life might change with societal challenges or personal needs, our rituals also may be part of lifelong development, an iterative process as we mature, a process that maybe over time approximates deeper meaning and authenticity. I'd like to roll back the time wheel to 1970 to show you what I mean. I was 12, and I bailed on my bat mitzvah, the rite of passage for many Jewish children to become ostensibly a member of the adult community. Nope. Not for that rebellious, aspiring peace, eco, women's movement activist who rejected the old world God with the white beard. I did, though, have some sense of meaning in my world. I was a dreamy child, a reader who loved C.S. Lewis, and I wandered the woods behind our house, sensing in wild orchids, box turtles, and distant pine groves something beyond the empirical. And I liked, don't tell anybody, the music and pomp of our religious services. But I didn't know this then, that the choice was not either to bail or to adhere strictly to formal observance. Instead, that one could revise without losing an essence as rich and nourishing as, yes, my mother's honey cake. One could render it meaningful, renew it on one's own terms. What I discovered, too, in the intervening years was that engaging with tradition, part of my tradition anyway, is a creative act with continuous reinterpretation of texts, an amateur lit crit and a philosophical scholarship soaked with personal experience and bookish nerdiness. For me, that's recreation, not just ritual. I also came to accept that if a God hovers in the ritual realm, they do not require my assistance or even belief. But let's be clear, my story is not a rising crescendo of successful ritual, off into the wild, back with permanent insight. I said earlier on that I stumble upon, as we all do, I stumble. The coconut story I read, it continues, jumping years later when my children had left home and I really wasn't motivated to do that elaborate meal and come up with new poems, and I was tired. Good riddance, kids. I don't have to do that stuff anymore. Not really. But I was looking at our old booklet of poems and stories that we used in that holiday, and I noticed on the cover we had this line drawing, very simple, of a tree. It was the New Year of the Trees, and it also had the roots of the tree, and boom, light bulb moment. I thought, wow, my son, who was in his early 20s at the time, had developed an interest in mushrooms of all sorts. And I thought, wait a minute, mushrooms, mycelial webs that whirled under the ground, the tree roots. There's something meaningful there. There's something going on that's hidden. The old mystics would have agreed. So I decided to focus on the roots rather than the tree fruits. Spoiler, the following year I added mushroom soup to the menu. Finally, I'd like to close with this question for you. Is this a ritual, my telling you stories, our listening to each other's stories? There are old precedents for that, of course. Christian parables, the life of the Buddha, communal readings of Torah chapters in my tradition. I am unsure if our personal stories work as rituals, but it certainly merits exploration. This ritual life is a long-term project of discovery and rediscovery, enlivened by occasional encounters with the ridiculous and the sublime. This month, I enter a season heading to the Jewish high holidays, a season that some describe as one of turning and returning. I wish you all a felicitous, meaningful rest of summer and a happy turning to fall. Thank you.